Welcome everybody to this Tree Rings webinar as part of the Urban Tree Festival on the topic of urban hedges, why they matter. I'm Neil Sinden from CPRE London. We've been curating the webinar series and we're going to wait a few seconds for people to join us and then we shall kick off formally. But while we're waiting a bit, I just wanted to say thank you all for supporting the Urban Tree Festival, which is largely volunteer run. Thanks to all of you who donated in signing up to this webinar. And if you haven't donated yet, please consider doing so. I will be pasting useful links and information in the chat bar as we go through the session this afternoon. I think we're doing pretty well with attendees. I think we're up to 40 plus. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sara, who will be chairing the session. Over to you, Sara.
Hi, thanks very much. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sara Lom, and I'm CEO of the Tree Council, which is the charity that brings everyone together for the love of trees. So welcome to the Urban Tree Festival. It's the time when we celebrate our magnificent urban trees and hedgerows and all the wonderful things they do for us. We're also celebrating today the unveiling of the England Trees Action Plan. And the Tree Council and our charity coalition partners have worked closely with government on the plan, which we're delighted includes a focus as well on street trees, on hedgerows, on ancient trees, alongside woodlands and commercial forestry. So this bodes well for the future. But we're assembled here now in this lovely virtual room for a conversation about hedgerows. And we're delighted to be joined by our experts, John Stokes, Mathew Frith, and Megan Gimber. We're going to explore the history of hedgerows, their importance for those who live and work in our cities, the benefits they bring, and the precious wildlife that they support. So the conversation is going to begin in just a moment, but an item of housekeeping: if you have questions, do please pop them in the Q&A down at the bottom, and we'll answer as many of them as possible at the end. Now, please welcome our first presenter, John Stokes, the Tree Council's Director of Trees, Science and Research, one of the great heroes of the tree world. John is also chair of HedgeLink, the partnership organisation for those who love hedgerows, and John has more than 3 decades experience planting and caring for trees, helping to shape policy and inspiring people of all ages to connect with nature. Yesterday, he and I were out at RHS Wisley, preparing for the launch of the first ever National Hedgerow Week, which is funded by government through the Green Recovery Challenge Fund, and it starts on the 29th of May. No doubt John will tell us a bit more about that. So over to you, John.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. Can somebody just confirm that?
Yes.
Yes. So I'm here to talk about the history of urban hedges. And as Sarah said, I've been a passionate fan of hedges for all of our 30 years of working. So I'm going to give you a little bit of context, and then the others are going to fill you in on some of the natural history and other aspects. So hedges have been part of our landscape as long as we've been on these islands. And the oldest landscape in the UK is down here in Cornwall. This is West Cornwall, and these hedges are about 7,000 years old. And so our history of managed hedges has become a very long and very sustained part of what makes Britain Britain. And obviously, as we've developed as through the centuries, we've used hedges and the products of hedges for our houses, for our homes, for where we live. And obviously, when we were hunter-gatherers, we didn't use hedges so very much. But as we became more settled, hedgerows and woven features of trees being used as hedgerows, like these stock-proof fences, which are woven out of hedge material, they all became part of our history. Where we lived had hedges. Where we lived was part of that relationship with the landscape and with hedges. And then when the Romans arrived, about 2,000 years ago, they introduced the idea of the garden hedge. And so garden hedges and that aspect of urban history is as old as the Romans have been here. And they introduced a whole range of species into their gardens, like elms, for example, for their supporting their hops, which are still present in our landscapes even today. This is one of the earliest pictures of the English landscape, and it shows that mixture of hedgerows around the towns, around the settlements, and people lived and worked. And what they wanted to do was have trees close to where they were. So they created the hedgerows. And the hedgerows were there as the peasants' forest to give that supply of wood where people lived. And you can see that written into the landscape of any urban area. This is where I live in Porchester in Hampshire. And the original field patterns are there from 1839. And then this is the street map. And if you overlay the two, what you end up with is that the roads were built on the hedges. And the houses were built in the fields. But sometimes, just occasionally, the original hedges are left fossilized in the landscape of an urban area. And you can see some of these things that were once the original countryside fossilized in that landscape. And that's true of almost any area where you get lines of trees along the roadside, where you get old hedgerows left in the landscape. It's become part of that history from a previous existence. And where we had hedgerow trees in the countryside, which led to this perception of what a hedge is, in towns, you get that same effect represented by the street trees. You get this same presence of a hedgerow in an urban area, just as you do in a countryside area. And you can see in this street that the garden hedges have become that hedgerow, and the street trees have become those hedgerow trees. So the landscape is constantly evolving, but the hedge has been present throughout that history. And where there aren't hedges, there are lines of urban trees, and those urban trees become part of that hedgerow infrastructure across London, linking together the landscape, creating that urban effect, which is so important, the trees, but they are effectively acting as hedgerows. And of course, the way we've managed our hedgerows over the years has impacted what shape they are, what they look like. And Megan and PTES specialize in that whole management, and Megan's going to do a lot more about this in a minute. But obviously, as we managed our hedges, we created kit, and the kit became more elaborate as we wanted to evolve the way we'd managed our hedgerows. But the management still exists in urban, in towns, in all sorts of places. People think they need to manage the hedgerows. When it's taken to its extreme, Megan and I were sent this photograph by the Irish Hedge Laying Society. Taken to its extreme, urban hedge management is not always necessarily done well. And I wouldn't recommend that anybody does this for the way they manage an urban hedgerow. But that whole process of how you manage a hedge in a town, in a city, and in the countryside is a really important part of making sure we protect and enhance those hedges going forward. And unfortunately, and I'm sure Mathew's going to cover this in a second, we have a tendency to clip hedges, particularly in urban areas, into clipped boxes. And sometimes they're clipped boxes and of the box. And that's creating problems with the arrival of things like box moths. So to maximize the urban value of a hedge, we need to let it get wider, bigger. And it is true whether it's in the countryside or in the towns. Whatever species, the bigger, the larger the hedges, the greater the opportunity for biodiversity. And even in a small urban area, an area of hawthorn or blackthorn can make an enormous difference to the biodiversity. And I know Mathew's going to cover a bit more about this later. And this is a hedge I actually planted nearly 30 years ago on the edge of the estate that I live, where you've created a linear hedge in an urban area where it has become something over 30 years. Now, is it a line of trees? Is it hedge? I don't know that I'm worried that much, but because it becomes a feature, it becomes part of the treescape. I would call that an urban hedgerow, but it's a line of trees that's providing biodiversity and value, even in an area that's where the grass is clipped, where people live. You can have these really important biodiversity features. And of course, what you really need in a hedge is a purpose. Now, in some parts of the country, they have hedges that are created for food, effectively linear corridors. And this is in Herefordshire, where they have hedgerows that are particularly rich in damsons. And those damson hedges become a larder for food, a larder for fruit, a larder for both wildlife and people. And we can do the same in urban areas. We can engage people with hedges by encouraging them to sample some of the food that exists in the hedge, to do some foraging. And for the last 10 or 15 years, Megan, myself, and others have become real devotees of foraging urban hedges, of going and collecting some of the food that exists out there. And in urban areas like in London, and this is in Merton in London, we've even planted hedges with the primary purpose of creating them to maximize the food production. So these urban fruit hedges are becoming something that are becoming more popular, becoming desirable, and are being planted across interestingly large areas of urban Britain. So that connection with people, that engagement of people with their landscapes and their hedges is really important. And here we are in Ealing planting an urban fruit hedge where we were creating a little mini orchard and a hedgerow around it. And this is about getting people to engage with those hedgerows, getting people to engage with the landscape in towns and cities. And as you can see, there's a nice old hedge along the boundaries of this once field, now park, where we're creating a new hedge, we're providing biodiversity, we're creating an opportunity for food and for wildlife. And in that, we've created a community of people who actually start to care about their hedge. And it's really important that we engage not only with the hedges, but we engage with the people who celebrate those hedges and who live with those hedges in those urban areas. So as Sara said, I have the privilege of chairing the national group for hedges, which is called HedgeLink. And that group is aimed at and promotes the conservation and management of our hedges through both the countryside and in the towns. And HedgeLink is a fantastic collection of experts dealing with hedges. But what's come out of that over the last few years, and as Sara said right at the beginning, we've wanted ways to engage people with hedges. So we are at the start of National Hedgerow Week, which is in just a week and a half's time. And the idea behind this is that we're trying to engage people with hedges in a way that they haven't before, getting people to think about their hedges in a way that makes the hedge real, because sometimes hedges get lost in the landscape, they get ignored, they get forgotten about. So we will have a series of webinars about hedges during National Hedgerow Week called Hedge Talks. There's going to be a social media campaign called Talk to the Hedge, which is about engaging people with the hedges. And there's going to be some photos and competitions and all sorts of things to try and get people to engage with hedges in a serious, in a way that makes the hedge live, makes the hedge interesting, makes the hedge important to that community. So do look out for that, because it's going to be an important part of the way that we're promoting hedges into the next few years. And so hedges are, for us, a really important part of urban landscapes as they are of rural landscapes. They are a vital part of the landscape that we need to protect, look after, and celebrate. And we are really delighted to be with you this lunchtime talking about hedges as part of the Urban Tree Festival, because there are so many hedges out there at the bottom of your garden, at the edge of your street, on the edge of the park. And it's about finding those hedges and celebrating those hedges and how they matter to your landscape. That really matters not just to us, but to the whole of the UK landscape. So thank you very much for listening. And Sara, back to you.
Thanks very much, John. That's a fascinating look back into the history of hedgerows and how they've shaped our countryside. And you can see the many different characters, I think, from those stunning pictures that hedgerows have. Do keep putting your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom. I can see that some of you are doing that already. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Mathew Frith, Director of Conservation at the London Wildlife Trust. Mathew is an urban ecologist, one of the very best, who has studied biodiversity conservation in our towns and cities for more than 30 years. Mathew managed Sydenham Hill Wood for half a decade, and he's deeply involved in policy development as well to protect and create wilder cities. And his biography tells us that his favourite trees are hornbeam and sycamore. So over to you, Mathew.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to quickly run through, following on from John's fantastic introduction to the history of the hedge in our towns and cities. And I'll follow on with a few similar kind of slides. This is a photograph taken at the beginning of the 20th century of an area which is now part of North London. This is the same site as it is today, with the same relict countryside of mixture of open pasture, fields and hedgerows and ancient trees, and it's now one of London Wildlife Trust's nature reserves. But of course, hedgerows and lines of vegetation arise by accident. This is an old railway route in South London, which forms part of the Green Chain Walk now. We have hedgerows which were created as much for privacy and protection as well as for biodiversity and amenity. The residential delineations, which John mentioned earlier, some of which are just kind of forgotten, and those trees then become much maturer, creating new tree belts. And again, a signifier here, this is an estate I used to manage, about how we could encourage a better kind of vegetation at their base. We don't actually have a very accurate figure of the amount of hedgerows we have in London. Surveys undertaken in 84-85 showed a kind of collective area of 369 hectares, which is probably a woeful underestimate. Another survey in 94 suggested 705 kilometres, which is just under the same length of railways in London. Again, probably an underestimate because it wouldn't have included the garden hedgerows. And we have 3.2 million garden plots in London. So if you could give an idea of what some of those, how many of those will be hedged, will be an interesting figure. Some boroughs have taken a bit more of an accurate survey of their hedgerow assets. Hounslow here, we've got 76.5 kilometres with a kind of a native plus definition. And Havering claimed that they had 32% of the London total, which again, I'd like to see the roots of that data because it seems quite a lot. But given what we know about Havering, which still has a lot of relic countryside pattern within the borough, that's possibly not too wayward. Now, the idyll in terms of hedgerow biodiversity is captured in this fantastic book published in 1980 called Hedgerow by Eric Thomas and John White. And it shows there a kind of mess of bramble and hawthorn with orange-tipped butterflies, robins, you know, and this is in some ways the kind of fantastic biodiverse hedgerows of tradition. And if they're managed well, there's no reason why most urban hedgerows, both in the countryside and in our towns and cities, can't look like that. And indeed, we can see some of that at certain times of the year. One of my favourite hedgerow plants is the blackthorn, here on a site in Croydon. We have climbers such as honeysuckle. We have a range of plants which will colonise the hedgerow skirts. Just 4 examples here. These will provide nectar sources for a range of insects. And then in autumn, those plants produce a fantastic bounty of fruits. John mentioned the damsons down in Hereford, but these berries will provide a fantastic resource for birds as well. Some of those are native species, such as blackthorn or the sloes, which we use to flavour gin. But some of those are non-native species, such as Cotoneaster and Pyracantha, which some ecologists have a bit of a problem with. But in terms of their value for birds in the autumn, you've only got to go to certain car parks in sort of October, November to see the waxwings coming in to feed on them. So just a fantastic resource there. And these are the kind of birds that we associate with our hedgerows, found right into the heart of London. So wren, dunnock, lesser whitethroat, fieldfare, robin, blackbird, song thrush, blackcaps, they will all utilise good structured hedgerows. And they will feed on not only the berries, but they'll also be looking for invertebrates, which again, encouraged by the plants and by the kind of rich structural nooks and crannies that hedgerows provide. And it's not just in summer, in autumn, you know, on a dewy morning, we will see the legacy of the spiders that come out and sow their, you know, spin their webs. And of course, they're the particular features that we find on many hedges. This is in London. It's an ancient sycamore. You don't see many of those. But again, that themselves will provide nooks and crannies for species such as bats, which will then use the hedgerows as foraging corridors. And we know that from studies undertaken by Bat Conservation Trust and the University College London show that these bats will will use the corridors that John showed in his images of trees down a street, as long as they're not too lit. And so there's an issue there about how we can design our cities with lines of trees, with lines of shrubs, but with more sensitive lighting can encourage bats to cross the city. And then last but not least, we have our reptiles and we have our mammals. And this interplay of species from plants, fungi and animals is of course integral to the life of a hedge. Now in planning issues, the importance of hedges is recognised in planning policy. We saw the hedgerow regulations set up in the 90s and reviewed again in 2002. And most local London authorities have policies to protect our hedges. But of course, it's not just about protection, it's about management. And we as an organisation have a legacy that we are responsible for. So this is the hedgerows in Totteridge Fields I showed you. But this is another example where we're working with a local allotments society back in the 1990s. This is just off the South Circular. We basically had to uncover this hedge. It could be completely swamped by bramble. It was invisible only apart from the time when the hawthorn brought out the berries. And we haven't forgotten this hedge. 3 years ago, we were returning to it, relaying it and bringing it back into kind of vigorous life again. There's also this kind of urban feature called dead hedging, which is using the brash from tree cutting, from hedgerow work, to create areas to prevent access, to avoid the trampling and compaction of soils in woodlands. We find these bring out mixed comments from our visitors, but we find them an essential part of our armoury to make sure that we can conserve our woodland features as best possible using natural materials. And yes, we are restoring hedgerows, but critically involving young people through our training programs to do that. And I'm sure Megan will touch on that as well, as in terms of broadening the appeal in the same way that John was showing in terms of planting. We can't forget that we have a complete range of quality in terms of our hedgerows in London. And some of these, this is an estate in Westminster, where frankly, they are kind of rather sad. But of course, that's where we create those linkages, as John showed the Ealing. This is another one in Southwark. And we can take that right into the city centre. So this is an estate in Hackney. Now, again, the question as John raised, is there a hedge? Does it matter? It's a mixture of trees, hedgerow, herbaceous planting, which forms a linear structure throughout the estate, food growing areas, orchard planting, biodiversity planting, it's all to the fore. I thought I'd show a picture of the box tree moth. This is the threat to the classic garden hedge and was, I think, was the primary source of queries to the Royal Horticultural Society in 2014 when it started appearing in West London. And it's, I think it's suffice to say this will become a threat to our garden privet, sorry, a garden box. And I just wanted to finish off with one other important thing, which is now on the agenda. We now know that hedgerows are an important contributor to us meeting net zero targets, but that will depend on how they are managed. And it's suggesting that we should raise the height of our hedges and our width of our hedges if we can make those hedgerows an important contributor to sequestering carbon, suggesting here 2 million tonnes of carbon in hedge biomass if we increase from 2 to 2.7 metres and widths ranging up to 4.3 metres. How that will square with other considerations remains to be seen. So thank you very much, and I look forward to taking some questions later on.
Thank you, Matthew. That's a great final slide there with Hawthorn Crescent. Great insight into the biodiversity of hedgerows and the important role that they play for that plethora of wildlife. And fantastic to see the community really involved in planting and caring for hedgerows, the hedgerow trees. So now we have our final presenter, Megan Gimber, hedgerow and habitat expert at the People's Trust for Endangered Species. Megan has been campaigning for better data on hedgerows, more connectivity across the countryside, and better management of our existing hedgerows. She has a great following on social media, thanks to her entertaining posts and her mini videos, and she's talking to us today from her narrowboat. So over to you, Megan.
Fantastic, thank you. Oh. Can everybody see my screen? Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see the script? Brilliant. Okay, so hi, I'm Megan Gimber and I work for People's Trust for Endangered Species. And my main focus is on hedges, and it's fair to say I am a bit hedge obsessed. While I'm aware that hedgerows themselves are not in fact an endangered species, it's a habitat that really fits well with the work that we do as a charity, as we focus on a number of species such as dormice and hedgehogs that depend on hedgerows. But it's very fair to say that our interest in hedges goes beyond any individual species now. Today, I've got the pleasure of giving a brief introduction to the basics of hedgerow management. But first, some context. Sadly, as mentioned earlier, we're facing the double threat of a biodiversity and a climate crisis. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that hedges are going to solve either of those, sorry. But please believe me when I say that they're a really good place to start, and they should certainly be considered part of our larger arsenal. 70% of the UK is agricultural land, and another 12% is urban. So what we do within both of those is hugely important for our native wildlife. And luckily, hedgerows have the potential to provide us with some easy wins. So, as far as I see it, they provide three large roles for wildlife. They provide a physical home. One study counted 2,070 species in just one 85-metre stretch of hedgerow in Devon. 2,070, that's a huge number. Now that was in a rural setting, but hedges, of course, are also one of our best urban habitats too. Secondly, they're an excellent complementary habitat. So one that might not necessarily be home, but plays an important role in life. So this can be providing food such as leaves, flowers, berries, or insects, or it could be shelter from predators or shelter from the elements. Thirdly, and importantly, they are a really useful wildlife corridor, and this helps connect populations of things that would otherwise be isolated and so vulnerable. So hedges are a man-made, man-managed habitat. So it might seem odd that they're so rich in wildlife, but while they aren't a natural habitat, actually in structure, they're what we call an ecotone, where two or more habitats overlap. And in this case, the structure of a hedgerow mimics the rich habitat of a woodland edge. So we have overlapping elements of woodland, scrub, and grasslands. And while a hedge certainly doesn't replicate any of those habitats fully, it does mean it's capable of supporting many species from each of them. So for some species, it's even greater than the sum of its parts, because some species are dependent on more than one or even all three of these elements. So I think a good example is a thrush, which will sing from hedgerow trees. It'll nest in the dense structure of the hedgerow itself, feed on invertebrates and worms and things at the base of a hedge, especially if it's got a nice wet ditch at the bottom, before moving on to hedgerow berries later on in the year. In fact, the closer you look at our native ecology, the more species you'll find that thrive on this rich woodland edge habitat. I don't have time to explain the squirrel, so I'll skip past that one. But sadly, we went through some dark decades of incentivized hedgerow removal after the war, and it looks like we lost up to about half of our hedges. Now, I'm glad to say this scale of outright removal is largely behind us, especially in the agricultural sector, although we are still losing many to land development. So it's worth reiterating that what we have now shouldn't be considered a baseline. And given all of that historic loss, it's more important than ever that our remaining hedges are healthy. But obviously, some hedges are in better shape than others, and the management they see has a huge impact on both their capacity to sustain wildlife and their capacity to act as effective wildlife corridors. Unfortunately, we do still risk losing many of our hedges, largely through the way they're being managed. And this is an issue both for rural and for urban hedges. The last countryside survey showed that only about half of our hedges are in good condition. This drops to just to about 10% in some areas of arable land. And unfortunately, I don't think we even have data for our urban hedge condition. And in a lot of cases, this poor condition is a result of the hedgerows no longer being managed according to their life cycle. Now, even if you don't give two hoots about wildlife, this isn't great, partly because of all the additional benefits that we're missing out on. So I'm often told that hedgerows have lost their function because fences are now cheaper and easier, but this ignores all of the other practical and environmental benefits that hedges bring us. So what have hedges ever done for us? I'm going to have to rattle through these pretty quickly. And I know this image represents the countryside, but I'll start with the benefits that relate to urban hedges too. So firstly, as mentioned earlier, they store carbon, both above ground and below ground. And within a few tweaks of management, like establishing more hedgerow trees and allowing hedges to be bigger on average, they could do an awful lot more of this for us. And that's before we even get into the idea of planting more hedges. We already have about 500,000 kilometres of hedges in this country, many in need of more trees, many in need of being bigger anyway. So they really have a huge potential to make a real contribution to carbon sequestration without taking much more land out of production. Next up, hedges and hedgerow trees can play a really important role in times of flood. So plant roots increase the rate of water infiltration into the soil. And this helps the soil act like a sponge to soak up water. So rather than allowing it to run off the surface and cause floods. And water isn't the only thing they soak up, they also soak up pollution, both agricultural pollution in the countryside and air pollution in urban environments as well, very importantly. So some plants are better at doing this than others. And in urban areas, research says that actually hairy-leaved plants turn out to be the best for soaking up pollution. And it's not just air pollution they can reduce, they're also really great sound buffers, so can reduce some noise pollution. So great if you live near a busy road, which, to be fair, I think is most of us. And also privacy. So hedgerows can act as a screen and protect privacy, helping us comfortably sunbathe in our own gardens, or shielding assets from sight, which might possibly help reduce some opportunistic crime. Then they provide shade, which is really important to our livestock here, but also pretty useful to us in urban areas too, as we have our picnics in the summer. And again, food, like the damsons in Herefordshire, not just for wildlife, but also for livestock, which will often be seen browsing on hedge plants, even with a field full of fresh pasture. Now, if you've ever picked any blackberries or sloes from a hedge, you know this benefit can extend to us too. Then, of course, there are the less quantifiable but extremely important benefits, such as the sense of place and, of course, our general well-being. If that wasn't enough, in agricultural land, hedges can also reduce soil erosion, provide pollinators, reduce pesticide use, reduce crop damage, increase livestock biosecurity, extend the pasture growing season. The list is essentially endless. But these benefits really rely on hedgerows being healthy. So how do we manage that? Now, I'm going to very quickly go through.
Let me just leap in and say you have got plenty of time, actually. So
do I have plenty of time? Oh, good, thank you. Oh, in which case I will stop speaking quite so swiftly. So all of these benefits and more which I haven't described really depend on hedgerows being healthy. So how do we manage that? I'm going to run through some of the basic principles of hedgerow management. So the first one sometimes comes as a bit of a surprise, but hedgerows do require some form of management in order to stop them developing into a line of trees. So a line of trees doesn't sound like a bad thing. We all love trees, but as everything competes for light and races upwards, they lose that thick, dense structure at the base, which is so valuable for wildlife. You get to a point where many of the trees will then topple, this line of trees may get gappy, and eventually it can be lost. Okay, so we've gathered that hedgerows do need some form of management, but the devil is in the detail. How and how often they're cut makes all the difference. So when they're young, or when recently rejuvenated, cutting a hedge fairly frequently can be a good thing. It changes the balance of hormones and helps create this really nice, thick, dense structure. Most of our hedgerow plants respond to the growing tips being cut off by putting more effort into branching growth. And if you keep doing this, but cutting a bit higher and a bit wider each time, you end up creating this amazing density of growth that provides such great shelter for nesting birds. But what about when you've already established this structure? How often should you cut a hedge then? Well, most of our hedge plants blossom and fruit on second-year wood. So hedges are best not cut every year, as all of this flowering and berry potential will then just get cut off. As an example, the hedge on the left here hasn't been cut in a few years, and it's absolutely covered in berries. Earlier on in the year, it would have been equally covered in blossom. The image on the right, taken just 5 minutes afterwards up the road, is another hawthorn hedge that is trimmed at the same point every year. And as you can see, it's completely devoid. So cutting, but maybe in longer rotations, seems like a win. Cutting every year, unfortunately, often goes hand in hand with cutting at the same height. And together, this leads to another issue threatening our hedges, and that is chronic over-trimming. So over-trimming not only reduces the value of these hedges for wildlife, but it also threatens the future of the hedge structure itself. Again, it loses this density at the base of the hedge, and I can't stress how essential that is for hedgerow wildlife. But then stems are lost, and while at first the remaining hedge plants kind of stretch to fill the space, which always reminds me of this painting, the more plants that are lost, the more difficult this becomes. And eventually this will lead to gaps forming in the hedge and then extending if management isn't then changed. This is a real problem for hedges around the country and in urban areas, but luckily it is avoidable. Back when hedges were trimmed by hand, the slashes would inevitably not take off all of the year's growth, as the oldest bits were already woody and tough. And it meant that hedges tended to get slightly bigger at every cut. And it's actually pretty easy to mimic this with mechanical tools. We just need to cut slightly higher, slightly wider every time we cut it. It might just be 10 centimeters, but it makes all the difference. You avoid structural damage to the hedge. You keep a border of young wood, so you'll always have flowers and fruit, even when you cut every year. And you end up with this thick, dense structure that's fantastic as a wildlife shelter, especially in urban areas. And again, this type of management is great in urban areas, as you can still cut it every year if you need to, but you will still get flowers and berries, and your hedge won't break free of the space that's allocated to it. And if you're worried about it getting unmanageably big, well, if you think of it like this, if you cut it 10 centimeters higher each time, even if you're cutting every year, it will still take an entire decade for your hedge to get just 1 meter taller. So it really isn't desperate. And after this, you can reshape your hedge, or if it's showing signs of thinning at the base, this would be a great time to rejuvenate it. So I think that covers how often and how. Next up, when? Well, many hedges are cut in September, when everything seems to get tidied up. But sadly, this cuts off all of the nuts and the berries. Hedges are supposedly wildlife's larder, helping birds and mammals fatten up in preparation for winter. But cutting them off in September means they don't get that chance. So we really advise, if you can, leaving it until late winter, wherever possible. And lastly, no matter how well you manage your hedge, it will at some point in its life need rejuvenation. Now, this could be laying or it could be coppicing, and essentially it resets that hedgerow cycle. Rejuvenation thickens a hedge back up from the base, and from here you can start the whole process again. And in this way, rejuvenation is the key to hedge immortality. So this is what all of that looks like put together. This is what we call the hedgerow management cycle, and it's my favorite diagram of all time. It shows that hedgerows are a dynamic living habitat, and so need dynamic management based on their life cycle. They aren't just green walls, and they cannot be treated as such. And if that seems like a lot to take in all at once, you're in luck. We've created some tools to help on a hedge by hedge basis. And very soon we will have a brand new hedgerow survey app called Healthy Hedgerows, which will offer a rapid assessment survey of hedges in just 6 questions. So this is being developed as part of Close the Gap, alongside HedgeLink, and as part of the Green Recovery Challenge Fund project. So what do we ultimately want to see? I want to see hedgerows bigger, better, and more joined up. I want to see them fulfilling their potential economically, ecologically, and environmentally. I want to see them managed on a life cycle with fewer gaps and more trees. I think the future of hedgerows looks good. They've weathered some pretty turbulent times already, from land enclosures to riots and uprisings. The history of hedgerows is actually almost as fascinating as its wildlife. But we are recognising the plethora of benefits they bring us now on so many levels. There's such a growing interest in making sure that they have a healthy future, as we're the ones that write the next chapter of their history. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Megan. That was terrific. You've inspired us all with your knowledge and your passion, and I love the tip about the hairy leaves and pollution. And apologies if you can hear a pneumatic drill in the background. I have people taking up pavement outside my house at the moment, so the noise pollution is all very much to the fore. And it would be great, that app that Megan was talking about, to get everybody involved when it's available, doing a speedy assessment of their own. Now I think we have time for questions. I can see that there are a goodly number in the Q&A box here. So the first one says, could you provide a list of simple gardening tasks that volunteers could engage in that would engage the local community? Sometimes gardening can be fiddly and perhaps lacks instant satisfaction. John, can I give you that one?
So probably the best thing that you can do, Tom, is not to do anything. Don't cut it. Don't manage it. Not until, as you had from Megan, it gets to the right point. The problem with a lot of urban hedges is they are over trimmed and over cut, and sometimes doing less is more. So, you know, if you want to maximize your biodiversity, don't spend the time cutting it. Explain to people why you're not cutting it. And my mum has had 20 to 30 years trying to persuade her neighbours that it's the right thing to do when they don't cut the hedges around the garden. Not sure she's still quite got there, but she spends her time on that rather than cutting it, which I think is much more worthwhile.
Fantastic, thank you. I mean, John Rose has asked, what's the best way to create a new hedge in an existing street rather than a new build? I don't know if one of you would like to answer that. Megan?
Happy to do
John?
it.
Are you happy to do it?
I think it's going to depend on the space that's available. Yeah, without knowing sort of what space is available or what creeps there are, it's a difficult one to suggest. But I'd say certainly work out what your hedgerow's for before planting it, and that will help you understand what species you'll put in it. You know, is it for wildlife? Is it for privacy? Is it for noise reduction, pollution reduction? So certainly work out what the purpose of that hedge is before working out what plants are going to go in it.
And sometimes working on the street is extremely complicated because that's local authority land with all sorts of underground cabling and all sorts of things. So it's often easier to work on the inside of the gardens, you know, the inside of the pavement where the gardens are, and talking to those individual homeowners to see if you can persuade them to do something. And then all that Megan just said is true.
So I can see that there was a message from Urban Tree Festival saying they'd like, I'm not quite sure, to answer live. Did you want to come in, Neil?
No, don't worry. Sorry, I'm confusing you.
Okay, no problem. So now trees and protection, always very much at the forefront of everybody's minds. With trees, you can get, this is Roger Chapman, you can get TPOs for protection within the planning system, but hedgerows have weaker, if non-existent protection. What more can we do? Is that a Megan or a Mathew or John? Do you want to kick off, John?
I'll start that one because I was involved when we were putting together the hedge regulations way back then, and there are some regulations that exist for hedges, but they aren't quite as strong as the TPO legislation. There's a constant process of review going on, and they particularly don't apply in urban areas. The urban hedge is not one that's necessarily easily protectable under almost any of the systems. So it is something that we've been looking at. Megan and I and others have, it's been a constant source of stuff that we've been looking at over the last 10, 15 years. We haven't cracked it yet. It isn't an easy one to solve. But we have hope that the new tree strategy, that's the tree action plan that's been produced today, will start to give us some tools that we can use, particularly with some of the changes that are going on in the planning legislation world that's going on. So I think it comes to organisations like all three of us that are here this morning to try and think of new ways, new methods to deal with it. And we haven't sorted it yet, but we hope we can make some inroads. I don't know if you, Megan or Matthew, want to add to that?
I was just going to add that clearly there's a strong aesthetic pull of a well-managed hedge, and given the planning white paper's influence on the building beautiful, whatever it's called, input, which is going to be taken forward by design champions in each local planning authority. So there's clearly an advocacy role of our collective organisations to push to make sure that some of these zones which are being identified within the planning white paper take account of hedgerows. I would say that in certain London areas, parts of London conservation areas will have hedgerows as part of their component, but I agree with the questioner in the sense that they don't have as much protection as trees which are awarded TPOs. And even as we know, that in itself is not sacrosanct protection either.
Yeah, I think this came up when we were talking recently, that you're absolutely right, that we do as a sector, I think, need to get together, and we need to get together with the developers and with the local authorities. And I think we'll be setting up some kind of workshop where we can establish principles and really look at where things are going in the future, because we do need better protection. So we'll keep everyone posted on that. Oh, there's a question here for you, Matthew, from Harriet Mogridge. Why are sycamore and hornbeam your favourite trees?
Very easily. Hornbeam is the London tree. It was the tree that effectively fueled London up until the Industrial Revolution through its charcoal. Also very important as a mechanical provider of mechanically powerful and strong and resilient timber and wood. And it's also a very versatile tree because it also serves as a hedgerow tree as well. And my first image was of a hornbeam hedge. And I remember getting quite a lot of complaints when I replaced a Cotoneaster and Pyracantha hedge in an estate with hornbeam, and all the leaves went brown in the winter, and I was accused of killing it. So it was used as a tool to inform residents that there is a cycle, seasonal cycle, and trees and many other things will change over the seasons. And it's been interesting looking at the amount of hornbeam hedges that have been planted in London in the last 20 or 30 years. There's a kind of renaissance of that particular species. And as for sycamore, what a brilliant colonizer. What a plant that can adapt to the kind of situations that we create. We've put huge amount of nutrients in our urban soils. We've disturbed them. There's one tree in particular that adapts to that very well. For some reason, we took against it in the 1980s. And when I was introduced into conservation, I was told that, sycamore had to be removed from woodlands. Why? In London, when half of our woodlands have got sycamore here naturally. If we didn't have sycamore, what else would they have? So let's embrace it. And hence my photograph of the mature ancient sycamore in Harefield as an example of, we very rarely allow them to become the mature specimens that you can see in Europe. Rant over.
Oh, what about you, Megan and John? What are your favourite trees?
Mine changes depending on the season, to be honest. It tends to be whatever's currently in flower. I appreciate them all and their seasonal variation.
And I've never particularly gone for a species, but I have individual trees that I like. So there are some splendid yew trees that I've fallen in love with in churchyards around the country. And there's an ancient oak in a hedge that I just think is one of the nicest trees in the country. But just to add a little bit to that Matthew just said, the sycamore, I also find almost no evidence. There's a suggestion that it's not a native species. I find almost no evidence for that. And there was a push a few years ago to try and make it the Celtic maple, and to try and make it a species that, because it is widespread in the west and north of the UK, and there are carvings on a gravestone in one of the Oxford University colleges of sycamore from the 11th century. So we do need to embrace sycamore a bit more as part of the flora that's out there, particularly in a changing climate.
I call it the railway maple.
And sadly, as we're losing many of our ashes, as there's a number of areas where their sort of niches overlap, so they may well do a really good job at sort of replacing some of the lost ash trees.
So I can see that Amelia has put two questions in the Q&A. So I'm just going to kind of put them together. We've dealt with some of it slightly already, but she says that she's concerned about the prevalence of flailing as management and the destruction of the hedgerow habitat. So what's being done to increase knowledge about better hedgerow management?
I can take that one, or I could give a starter for 10.
Yeah,
well, HedgeLink is obviously an organisation that tries to encourage best practice with hedgerow management, and it doesn't necessarily mean not flailing. It might just mean adjusting how we cut hedges, how often we cut hedges, and what shape we cut them to. So HedgeLink is, I would say, the first port and call, I would say, for anyone that wants to understand hedgerow management a little bit better. It's probably where I should mention that our app, which will be coming out in a month or so, called Healthy Hedgerows, it will be a rapid assessment survey of hedgerows, which basically gives you feedback about how healthy your hedgerow is, but also how best to manage it from there. So the idea is we want to get people managing their hedges on the life cycle again, so allowing them to go through their sort of cycle of succession, to change, to get bigger, and then to be reset by laying or by coppicing. So we're really encouraging that life cycle approach, which we think makes the sort of the healthiest and the most beneficial hedgerows for wildlife and for us as land managers. So that's something that we'll certainly be promoting this coming year.
And there will be lots of new information going up as part of the Close the Gap project on HedgeLink, working with the University of Reading and with Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group, More Trees down in Devon. So everybody feeding in their knowledge and expertise. So do keep visiting the HedgeLink website as we go along. I can see we've got quite a number of questions, which I haven't managed to look at in total.
So there are a few simple ones, Sarah, that maybe we can...
Yeah, why don't you pick those?
So Pamela asked one, should we encourage gardeners not to trim their hedges quite so often? Simple answer, yes. Because as we've said, they matter. Amelia's asked, can we check that the recommendation is the hedge is cut that is wider at the top? So Megan, do you want to deal with that one?
Well, actually, depending on the shape of your hedge and depending on where the situation is, cutting them in an A shape actually can help, because it allows light to get to the base of the hedge. And again, I know I talk about the base of a hedge an awful lot, but it really does show sort of the health of the hedge in general. So it tends to be that if you cut on a slight A shape, you get plenty of light getting to the base. All the regrowth grows up rather than out, which means you don't necessarily have to cut it so often, and you can kind of mimic a sort of slightly more natural structure that way.
There's a question which is a simple question about whether hedge laying affects carbon capture abilities, which is a simple question to ask and a really difficult question to answer.
Yeah.
So the answer is, obviously it changes the balance of the carbon capture that the hedge is doing. A large percentage of the carbon that's captured by hedges by the underground features, so it's stored under the ground, and obviously it doesn't affect that. Depends what you do with your material that you've taken from your hedge. If you've locked it up and used it in other things, which is hard to do with hedgerow risings, but hard to do. But if you're using it, letting it slowly degrade, then obviously that carbon is locked up for a short period, but that is quite a complicated one. but the hedge rapidly regenerates and gets you back to carbon neutral. So the hedge above ground remains carbon neutral, but the hedge below ground keeps managing, keeps retaining lots more carbon. So it slows it down a bit while it's happening, but it's not necessarily a severely problematic thing. Megan?
There are a few things that we can do to help manage that. Sorry, John.
Yeah.
When you're laying a hedge, quite a lot of material does get taken out, and it's really what you do with that material once it's out of the hedge as to what happens to that carbon. So that can be used to make habitat piles, dead hedges, to be used to sort of protect maybe coppice hedges or things as well, which is fantastic for wildlife and will slowly break down. They can also be, chipped. Some of the, as John said, it's not huge timber that can be locked up, but the material can be chipped and get used in mulching for new trees, which is a really good use of it. And if on a smaller scale, you can actually do things like creating what's called biochar with it, which is like a form of charcoal, which actually can lock away, I think, up to about 70% of the carbon, which can then be used as a soil conditioner and is a really valuable product.
Great. Mathew, you've answered this slightly in I think live, but there's a question here from local police in Haringey have say they want shorter hedges.
Yeah.
You had a good response to that one.
Yeah, I mean, it's a long-standing issue. I was asked to remove hedges from estates because apparently muggers only hid behind those. They didn't hide behind walls or sheds or houses or cars or anything else, but anything that could be removed simply without causing offence to some people. It's not affecting the actual cause. I'm afraid it's another issue that's been dominated by what I call design, secured by design, which was a kind of initiative that came out in the late 1980s and is kind of adopted in planning circles, and the police use it when it's all to do with buildings and spaces, and it has in my view, a lowest common denominator approach. I don't think there's an easy answer to this. And clearly in hotspots of crime, then we have to be politically sensitive to how matters are addressed. But I think there is a longer term advocacy there, again, with advising the police and advising those who consult with the police and liaise with the police on secure spaces effectively, and how management of vegetation needn't be destructive in those spaces. Yeah, there's clearly an issue about natural surveillance, but I think it's a rather simplistic approach.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. We don't want anything that will discourage beautiful hedgerows in our cities, certainly. So what the panel, what would you recommend for best management for hedges next to main roads? Any thoughts on that?
You have to, sorry, Megan.
Oh, go for it.
You have to manage for road safety because you can't have things poking out into the road that might drive people onto the, from the footpath into the road. So unfortunately, that is on the road side, that is where you have to do your management. But on the top and the other side of that hedge, there is scope for leaving it to let it go taller or wider on the side away from the road. But unfortunately, on the roadside, health and safety is the priority always. And so it's often that has to be managed quite carefully to enable people to access the road and to access the pavement.
And perhaps at the same time as we're talking about hedgerow management, we can talk about the question, would a 4-year-old native hedge still need watering in London if it's very hot and exposed? I find it gets powdery mildew if I don't.
Yes, is the answer. Probably because if it's hot and dry, it needs to become established, and the base needs to become a bit shaded by the vegetation above it, just to let the water retain. Mulch can help. It's always worth putting some mulch on. If you can't get mulch, it's a bit unsightly, but things like bits of old carpet can sometimes be helpful just to keep a bit of moisture in the soil. But the powdery mildew is probably not a function of the water. The powdery mildew is, if it's on oak, is just a function of powdery mildew being out there, and that's the problem of dry summers. But yes, it probably does need a bit more water for a few more years.
Okay. Well, John, whilst you're there, we have a couple of questions that are to do with railway embankments. One is we have a lovely sycamore which is TPO'd. Can we reduce them down as a hedge? And the other one is gone. Also, managing vegetation along the railways is the sort of general.
So there is a problem that you, unless you work for the railway company, you can't manage the hedgerow, any trees inside the railway embankment, because it's a really protected place, which is great for wildlife because it creates that corridor, but it's not necessarily good for easy access for management. So it has to be done by the railway companies, because they're the only people that can work inside the fence. Network Rail are in the process, and we're helping Network Rail through a process of looking at how they're managing their urban areas inside the fence. And hedges do become part of that, because it's good for the railway. It makes the trees safe. They're much less likely to fall on the railway than if they're tall and spindly. But TfL, which was referred to, is another. I don't know about TfL's policies per se, but there is great hope that they can move into the idea of working with hedges on railways, because they're suitable. Scrub is a really suitable, biodiverse, fabulous habitat alongside railways that creates lots of wildlife, but reduces many of the problems of safety that taller trees can have. So if anybody knows of anybody from TfL that we can talk to, we'd be delighted to talk to them.
Well, TfL are part of the London Urban Forest Partnership, and there's a couple of very vocal individuals on that. Clearly, they've got a huge remit, not only the railway network, but also the street network as well. And I think, their top level commitments are okay, they're fine. But same with Network Rail, which led to the Varley review, which we've yet to see the results actually in the field, so to speak. It's sorted down, from our perspective, because we've been dealing with this for 30 years or so, and we manage a railside nature reserve, but it's the contractors and the fact that the skill set, we've hardly touched on skills today, but the skills to actually manage trees, hedgerows, shrubs, whatever, in a sensitive fashion, both in terms of time, both in terms of intensity, both in terms, all those kinds of things which you're all familiar with. But most contractors don't have that skills. It's slash and burn still, and I'm happy to be quoted on that. And it's high level commitments is not being seen on the ground because time constraints, financial constraints, etc., etc.
Total agreement, more training, absolutely training and skills. I mean, I think we have seen a move. The utilities, the transport networks are very often fantastic engineers, but they are not environmentalists. So persuading, giving the skills and training to ensure that both they and the contractors that they use do pay attention and start coppicing and pollarding and creating that scrubland that's so vital rather than clear felling is really important. And yeah, we're all working very hard towards that, and I think there is some movement, but it isn't fast enough. I think there's a question here, Mathew, that would be great for you, and I'm conscious of time. So with very limited space in my garden, what would be your top 3 all-rounder shrub species to plant for general wildlife benefit?
Hawthorn, blackthorn, hazel. That's just 3 choices.
Okay, I ask the others. Same.
I think I'd definitely go for hawthorn, and I'd go for hazel. I think in a garden I might go holly rather than blackthorn, just because I've had 1 or 2 blackthorn punctures in my time that take a little while to heal.
Yes, it's sharp.
And I agree entirely with both my colleagues, but I might add a few apples into the mix, because you can create apples in almost any shape on a hedge by a good bit of management. And so I've got apple hedges around my garden just because.
And few plums, as we've discussed before, always go down very well. So I think there are some questions remaining, but sadly we don't have time to do them all. But we will try and answer the remainder in the chat at some point. I want to thank all our fantastic presenters for sharing their knowledge and their expertise, and I also want to say thanks to Neil Sinden and Tess Pettinger from the Urban Tree Festival for creating this amazing festival that everybody can be at. And one final heads up for National Hedgerow Week, starting on the 29th of May, do visit the HedgeLink website, do visit the Tree Council website, and look for all those webinars, which will be a whole range of things, not only horticulture, arboriculture, but art and books, and so on and so forth, all relating to the hedgerows. Listen out, fingers crossed, for a feature on gardeners' question time, and let's all talk to the hedge. Thank you so much again for joining us. Neil, do you want some last words, or?
No, thank you,
No?
Sarah, and thank you for some excellent presentations, and thank you all for attending. If you haven't donated, there's a link in the chat, and if you want to find out more about what's on the programme for the rest of the week, there's a link there too, urban-tree-festival.org. See you again. Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much.
Bye.